Well, thank everyone for joining us to this awesome opportunity for the Emerging Technology Community of Interest and the Evolving the Workforce Community of Interest to jointly have a conversation on breakthrough technology and ethical considerations for workforce. We love getting together with the Evolving Workforce COI. We've done it a number of times, and so thank you for joining us today. So we're going to just knock out some logistics so we can get to the good stuff. But as you can see, we got an agenda here before us. We've got some updates to go through, and then we'll get into the meat of the program today. But for those who don't know the Emerging Technology Community of Interest, we focus mostly on those fringe things or things that are just hopefully becoming useful to government. So blockchain is one that's been around for a while, but AI, machine learning, robotics process automation, IoT, and we'll talk here actually on the next slide. We're going to start doing stuff on quantum. So you'll see. Go ahead, Nancy. You'll see our list of leadership for the Emerging Technology Community of Interest. I'm the government chair currently, and Raven, who's also on the call I noticed, is our government vice chair. So thank you for joining us, Raven. And Frederick Duvall is on. He's our industry vice chair. Todd was unable to join us today, and we got a smattering of others who are joining us. But we wanted to call attention to the lower right-hand corner of the slide. We are beginning to try to kick off a quantum community of practice. And so if you're interested in helping get that started, or if that topic is of interest to you, want to participate, just reach out to any of us, myself or Todd or anybody on the leadership team, and we can get you connected. So having said that, I think it's time to pass it over to Evolving Workforce. Terry or...
Muted, of course. Sorry. Good morning, everybody. Andrew McCoy, the outgoing industry chair for the Evolving the Workforce COI. Only two quick updates that we have. Here's our leadership team looking forward to next year. Brianna Coleman was recently won the election and taking over an industry chair, and she's been involved, I think, with actually both of our COIs, definitely emerging technology and our COI. She was previously on our program committee. So we're excited to see the leadership that she brings to the group. Nancy, next slide, potentially. The only real, there's the update. Brianna, congratulations. And I'm sure you'll do better than I did within the role. So happy to see where you take the group, but still look forward to staying involved and working with ACT-IAC and other areas. The only other update is we're finally at the launch point of our new project. I talked about it on our last couple events, but hiring transformation is the title of the project, leveraging commercial best practices to improve federal diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. We've got a fantastic list of volunteers, mixture from industry, government, and even some academia side. So we're definitely excited for this project, and right now it's looking to kick off in the next week or two and looking to have our report published by the end of the calendar year. So we're looking probably about 6 months of working that project and more to come. With that, that's it for me. And then, so is it Austin or Mike? Kick it back over to y'all to introduce the panel.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew. I know, Mike, we have the committee team updates. Did you or Jeremy want to cover that before I do the introduction?
Sorry.
Yep, we can walk through those. I think there's slides for each one. Nancy?
No, I don't know. We don't have slides.
Okay, very good. So let me talk to them real quick, okay? Basically, in emerging technology, we have several working groups, and starting a new, like Jeremy said, we're starting a new community of practice in the quantum world. It's a privilege to work with each one of these folks. The AI working group has been very active in they've gotten their primers out, they've gotten their playbooks out. We've been working on different asks. One of them was a white paper that the White House asked us to do to look at the ethical use of AI. So a very, very active group. Blockchain working group, obviously very, very active, got all their documents out. I'm gonna come back to blockchain to talk about some of the other things that we're doing. Devops is in play right now. I don't know, Jeremy, I think they're almost done with their playbook. Close to being done with their playbook. That's led by David Hernandez. Intelligent automation working group is, again, that next step up from RPA. They're working on their documentations. And IoT smart tech, smart cities. That's something that started, led by Don Lovett and I think Pete Saronis are driving some of those. Great leaders in each one of these groups. I just want to say that we are moving, especially in emerging technology, from tell me to show me. And that's been a great move in the last couple of weeks where we can talk about this stuff all day long. I said, but the idea is we want to see it in action, and we're beginning to see that. We are teamed up not only with the Evolving Workforce, but we work with the acquisition team. We released a paper, and this is going to kind of kick me off, and then I'll turn it over to Austin real quick. Basically taking a look at what emerging technology does to the workforce. I'm sorry, everything we do touches the workforce, and that's something we have to be sensitive to at all times. Whether it's the effecting workforce, those who implement, plan, buy, put in place, monitor, or whatever, to the affected workforce, those whose jobs change because of the technology. And again, it's something we're noticing that everything looks at the workforce, and so we're very, very sensitive to that in the work that we're doing. With that, I'll stop. Exciting group of people. Love working with them. And we're actually working again also with another joint COI, with the acquisition COI. We'll be doing a Shark Tank in the fall. So keep your ears and eyes open for that. Okay, thank you. Austin?
Thank you, Mike. To set the stage for today's panel discussion, which is really something that we want to do in concert with the audience. So we are grateful for everyone who has joined us today. We have three fantastic experts that will provide insight and interesting views on this topic. And the way this will work is that each of our three speakers will provide quick opening remarks, and then we will move into a moderated Q&A discussion. We want this Q&A discussion to be driven by you in the audience. So when our panelists are speaking in their opening remarks, please take note, any questions or comments you have. We will quickly want to pivot to those. We really want this discussion, and this is more of a discussion, to be driven by your interest in the audience. These opening remarks will provide you with a view into the specialty and the perspective of each of these experts. And then we want to have a discussion with our experts and with you in the audience based on your interests. So we will pivot to these opening remarks in just a moment. We will begin with Dr. Jordan Roberts, who will provide a view from government leadership on this topic. Following Dr. Roberts, we'll have a opening remark by Kelvin Liu, who is an engineer at USDS. He will provide a great view as someone who's working with this tech, making no-go, go decisions at the technical level in government with this technology. And following Kelvin, Mike will provide opening remarks from the strategic leadership perspective of industry on this same topic. So I think that we will be able to hit this discussion from three useful and different perspectives. So I don't want to hold you any longer from our speakers. So with that said, I will go ahead and pass it on to Dr. Roberts to kick off the opening remarks.
Sorry, muted. If you want to go to the next slide, just to clarify, I'm Jordan Robbins. I think there's an error in my name in the slide, so just put a quick correction in there. And if you want to go to the next slide as well. So good morning. I'm one of the branch chiefs within Customs Border Protection's Personal Research and Assessment Division, also known as PRAD. PRAD serves as internal consultants within CBP, and it's responsible for developing assessments and evaluation tools for the agency, supporting organizational and workforce development, and building a mission-ready workforce within the agency. My team's portfolio in particular deals with things like the Supervisory Managerial Promotions Program, as well as career pathing. Now, the work we've been doing has really been changing as the environment changes. It really has forced us to rethink the way we've been doing things in recent years in order to promote greater efficiency, flexibility, and access for our services. This has become really particularly pronounced over the last year and a half during the recent pandemic, which really upended the status quo for us. PRAD has been making a concerted effort to leverage cutting-edge technologies where possible to improve the candidate user experience. It's been a really important thing for the group, and has recently instituted a number of improvements in their services, including things like interactive dashboards, automated bots, and remote proctoring. So I want to talk a little bit about this work. Now, built on business intelligence software such as Cognos and Power BI, we've recently started to implement some interactive dashboards when providing promotion assessment results to both candidates and hiring managers. The tools we developed have been very high touch, very user-friendly, and provides the user with the ability to really dig into the results to determine both the areas of strengths and need for improvements. And it does this a lot more clearly and a lot more in depth than they could previously in the past with more of the traditional PDF-based reports. Now, these reports are used to both support career development as well as hiring managers' ability to make objective, competency-based selection decisions. Now, in recent years, our division has been asked to do more without getting more resources, in some cases even with less resources. One way we've approached this challenge has been to work to automate routine functions where we can, where possible. To this end, Prad has been working with some of our internal business partners within CBP to create a series of automated bots to really reduce the time spent on some routine data management and communication tasks. This could be things like transporting data between different systems we work with, doing scoring for some tests we're currently trying to develop, as well as help facilitate some communications to provide the workforce with some FAQs or really important information in a quick manner to help reduce questions we may get into the inbox and other issues as they occur. While these may take considerable time to develop upfront, once they're in place, they really can drastically reduce the amount of time we spend on a given function. For example, a single function could take at times 5 to 10 minutes, and with these bots in place, it may take 20 or 30 seconds to do instead. Now, over the course of a week, this yields some real gains for us. Something that employees could be spending 10 hours on may instead take about 30 minutes now. This really does free up our staff to allowing them to really focus more on other critical work or other novel or interesting work that we wouldn't always have time to do otherwise. Now, furthermore, when we combine this with the interactive dashboards, we really get some good gains here. It allows us to provide key stakeholders with updated information in more real time with minimal lag. Whereas previously it could take us days, if not weeks at times, to get everything together and get it over to them. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is our testing program. It's one of our centerpieces of the division. In FY20, for example, we've tested roughly 8,200 candidates through our promotions program. The majority of this testing does occur currently at proctored settings and proctored test centers. We currently use about 305 of them, both around the country and even around the world in parts of it. Now, one thing the pandemic has made abundantly clear for us is the ability for unforeseen events to really disrupt this in-person testing. In some cases, we've actually been forced to really fall back on some more archaic methods, such as paper and pencil testing, when the test centers remain closed for prolonged periods of times in the worst case, or in other cases, the testing window, which would normally be about 4 weeks for a program, was extended to roughly 6 months at times during the pandemic to allow everyone the opportunity to test. This delays certs, this delays the ability for offices to hire, so it's really not an ideal situation. We have been working closely with our vendor to establish a remote proctoring system that will allow candidates to test from other locations, such as home, or a secure room, either in their office or some other environment. Now, we're hoping this process will provide many of the same benefits as in-person testing, without really the need for the candidates to travel or deal with these disruptions that could potentially occur. Now, when approaching this, we really looked at 2 different options. One was a live proctor remotely. Basically, they see the individual on a webcam, they show them the room, and they're basically there to observe the candidates as they're taking the assessments. They could talk to them if necessary, give feedback, and basically raise issues with them as they occur if they see something happening. The other option is more of a record and review process where the individuals are recorded. It is then reviewed by essentially an AI system to flag potential incidents, and then those incidents are reviewed by an individual who then could reach back out to us basically to say something went wrong and to then deal with that. Now, for our purposes, We decided to go with a live proctor in this case, primarily because our promotions testing really is pretty high stakes. It involves a lot of relatively senior individuals in the agency. And at the moment, we're frankly not completely convinced of the integrity and, more importantly, the perceived integrity of the AI-based review, especially when there's not a human on the spot. It could potentially place our agency in a fairly precarious situation if an individual's flagged after testing occurs and then it invalidates their results. We feel more comfortable from a testing standpoint to do this with the live proctor as a result. But this process will ultimately provide candidates with greater flexibility. And also it has some substantially reduced costs, both for the candidates in terms of travel and for the agency in terms of the time it takes. Currently, folks can travel 2 hours to test. Down the road, this could potentially reduce that, as well as stop the need for some of the mobile sites we may need to set up or some of this paper rental testing process. Next slide, please. Now, while these technological innovations provide a number of benefits, they do raise some potential challenges and ethical considerations as well. While the interactive dashboards do help the users dig into the assessment information, there's always potential for misuse here, especially if hiring managers use it in a way that does not follow our competency models or the requirements of the job. To help combat this, we did have established some relatively clearly defined SOPs and trainings to show them how to use it. Although to be quite honest, part of the reason we instituted these dashboards was to help standardize the process. Previously, hiring managers could potentially take the data we give them, create their own dashboards with their own metrics and ranking procedures, which could potentially get us into trouble, again, if they don't follow the merit promotion procedures. Now, the automated bots, they do make our processes much simpler to execute. The downside of this, however, is it does also remove my team from what's being done behind the scenes after it's developed at the very least. And this could cause some risks for us, especially when something goes wrong. We have put a series of checks and balances in place and really an audit function that would allow us to periodically check what's going on and hopefully catch results before they get out of hand. There have been some cases where this has happened so far, and it really allows us to get ahead of it before it becomes a problem. Now, the remote proctoring, while it's used somewhat in the private sector, is at this point pretty novel in the federal government. We did a fair amount of benchmarking prior to starting this process, and really there are very few folks that are very far along in this process at the moment. It does add some unique challenges for the federal workspace. One of the big ones is privacy. Both the record and review and the live proctors, they both have the webcams in someone's home or whatever location they're in, and the folks are recorded. We do have to work with the vendor to deal with how to handle this data, the record for retention and deletion. And it is a concern that folks may have that they are being recorded here. It also has the potential to present folks with a different type of testing environment than they may experience in a test center itself. Now, that said, when you compare the remote proctoring to the paper and pencil testing, we do feel this will be a much more similar sort of environment. So we are looking for some gains here. But we will be working with the vendor to constantly revise and improve this over time to ensure that experiences are as similar as possible. Now, one of the big challenges is not all users may have equal access to computers, secure locations, or even the internet. This may actually be particularly challenging at times like now, when you could have multiple people working at home together, maybe even kids running around, and that may make it difficult to have a quiet, secure location. This is part of the reason that at least during the pilot phase, we are definitely keeping the test centers still in place. This is really meant to augment it at the moment, to help us reduce the need for some of these mobile test sites, to help us eliminate the need for paper pencil testing. But in the cases that that doesn't work, we still could fall back into test centers or other situations as necessary. Now, as we monitor and revise these tools, we're constantly looking at developing trends within the industry that can be used to really improve our services. We do tend to err on the conservative side when implementing, and our primary concerns will remain twofold. How do these tools maximize the utility of the customer or the workforce. And we really want to ensure these tools are also appropriately developed, reliable, valid, and defensible in case a grievance is raised. As some of the more advanced AI technology and machine learning processes continue to mature, we'll be constantly monitoring this and looking how we can incorporate it into our program as well. Thank you.
Thank you kindly, Dr. Robbins. And we will pass it on to Kelvin Liu. And just as a reminder to the audience, as Kelvin's speaking and as Mike is speaking after Kelvin, if you have any questions, comments, please put them in the chat box or save it for the Q&A session. We will really look to guide this discussion with your thoughts. And so with that, Kelvin, please kick us off.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelvin Liu, as mentioned. I'm an engineer with the United States Digital Service, which is an agency out of the Office of Management and Budget. To provide some context for today's talk, I've shared a screen here. This is the smiqua.usds.gov site, which basically goes over the pilot program that I was a part of and the results from it. So just kind of going over that as the background very quickly, we had roughly 10 pilots, with those across some 20 different agencies. Some of them were GovWide, some of them were not GovWide. We had some 3,500 plus applicants that we saw through this process, and those ended up resulting in about 240 selections. So for those of you in government, you probably know that for having 10 hiring actions and having 240 selections in the competitive service, that's kind of a big deal. And these are all GS13 plus hires, from UX designers to foreign affairs officers. And so it was a fairly successful pilot that we're still partnering with OPM on pushing it forward. To make this pilot successful, some of the things that we used were like existing technology and off-the-shelf things such as scheduling and interviewing. We also ended up building collaborative tools for augmenting traditional processes like resume review. And that's kind of one of the areas that I think is of specific interest to this group. Those are building some of this technology. It resulted in a lot of time savings. As Dr. Robbins had mentioned, even just small time savings that we make in any of these processes due to the scale of government result in a lot of efficiency improvements. So we built out this resume review tool that allowed for subject matter experts and and HR professionals to work together and make sure that they're hiring candidates in unbiased ways. That was so subject matter experts could do the process and then be evaluated by HR, and they have this collaborative process, right? The details aren't that important, but the point is that building out some tool that replaces a process that would normally take place over email already resulted in tons of savings. This allowed for cross-agency collaboration. It allowed for asynchronous collaboration, and these are all sort of areas that we can improve a lot as a federal government. Other areas of specific interest to this is that when we were starting this pilot, we did evaluate using AI to look at resume reviews. We really found that the technology wasn't quite there yet, mostly due to the fact that resumes are pretty noisy. We can look at things like other agencies, or not agencies, other companies such as Amazon, slightly, have a lot more technical talent maybe than the federal government. They're one of those companies that seems to know what they're doing with technology. They also had to shut down their resume review or their artificial intelligence use of resume review because there were a lot of gender biases there. So looking at that, and then also looking at just how noisy resume reviews are in general, right? When you think about a resume, you have, people are just trying to write out what they do for a specific job. There's not a prompt, there's nothing else like that. That's just a ton of noise going into an AI. And until we can reduce the amount of noise there, it's going to be really hard to have an AI evaluated resume in an unbiased way. So I do think there are worlds in which we would be able to use AI to evaluate areas where it's like, hey, look, this applicant, this resume might actually be, there might be some human bias looking at this thing, or we can actually use it to augment the process rather than using it to evaluate every individual candidate. There are also worlds in which we could use AI to segment our list into very clear passes and failures. But again, right now, just in terms of where the technology and where resumes are, there's a lot of noise that's going in and out of those systems. So just like Dr. Robbins, the AI, we just feel like it's not there yet, and that's why we opted not to use it. So I think those are all the main points of it, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here and leave a lot of time for questions. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Mike Maloney.
Thank you very much. So Good morning, everyone. I'm Mike Maloney. I am a talent development optimization lead for U.S. Federal with IBM. So if we go to the next slide. And I just want to really talk about, and I know we just finished a very short discussion on artificial intelligence, so I just want to focus a couple minutes on using artificial intelligence to assess the skills, whether it's a commercial world, whether it's a U.S. federal world. I've spent 28 years in the federal government as a member of the United States Air Force, in the last 15 at IBM as an executive. So we're going to talk a little bit about use of AI and assessing the skills. So let's go to the next slide. And we've had lots of discussion already today on this call that talked about workforce disruption. And I've heard RPAs, automation, bots. So what I really want to do today is focus a little bit on how we utilize artificial intelligence to assess those skills that allows us to better utilize the employees in your organization, whether or not it is reskilling or upskilling. And as you can see on the slide, you know, skills are the new competitive currency. I'm sure you've heard that before. A lot of people think that in the past it was technology. That was the real differentiator. But now what we do is we boil it down and we look at people, but we look at people who have various skills and competencies. And as we see on the slide, it does touch everything. We've already talked a little bit about how are you going to grow your force? How are you going to use potential skilling to look at new employees? How are you going to develop your employees? How do you mobilize them, as well as engage them, and just as importantly, retain them? And all of these have a play in skills inference and artificial intelligence. So the opportunity that we see when we look at this is how to unlock those skills, and taking artificial intelligence to take a deeper in-look, a deeper dive into the individuals, how to unlock those hidden skills that maybe AI has seen, and then how to take that talent across your organization and know where that knowledge exists, and then how to provide the transparency to you as well as the employee, so you as the manager and the employee, to provide that so that we can look at skills where they're needed in the organization. And I've heard a couple things already today, and the one thing that we like to emphasize with artificial intelligence is it's here to support the organization. It's here to support the staff. We rarely try to utilize AI as a standalone. It's there to help the employees as they look at their career, conversations, as we look about reskilling and upskilling, as I mentioned, as well as compensation. And that's something that sometimes people forget about when they talk about skilling, as well as the executives and the people leaders. All of them are interested in what is that talent strategy? How am I going to move it to the next level? When we look at things like RPAs and automation, many times that displaces your current employee. And what you don't want to do is to take an employee who has real knowledge of an organization or the government itself and move them out and bring someone in with a new skill. That's where AI can help with skills inference to help you reskill and upskill. Let's go to the next slide. So when we talk about this, I think there are a couple, 3 steps that we go through that I think any organization can go through. And that is, first, your understanding of what your current skills are. And that is, what are the skills of the workforce? I heard earlier on this call, people talked about quantum. Looking at your current skills, looking at your future skills. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we really didn't talk a lot about cybersecurity, and now it's the hot topic all the way to the White House. We talk about data scientists. We talk about the quantum folks. All of these things are important as you're driving your organization to the next level in the future. So when you look at them, you need to understand your skills, And hopefully it's a taxonomy that you have today. When you look at a job series, you look at a job, you look at the skills as well as the competencies that are required to do that job. And then we look at the individuals, and we look at all of the potential data. We look at CVs or resumes. We look at performance appraisals. You can ingest engagements, courses, and those courses can come from any one of your learning management systems. It can come from any other resource, and you ingest that. It doesn't have to be a vendor specific. You can, if you have Workday, if you have Taleo, if you have Cornerstone, it really is something that is transparent across the board. And then what you do is you apply those skills. You look at the skills you need, you look at your employees, and then you infer those competency levels and drive forward to help close those gaps. And as managers and executives know, to coach your people for the future. So let's go to the next slide. So I want to give you just a really quick example of looking at an employee's digital footprint. We talked about what is it that AI is going to do? How are we going to dig a little bit deeper? So we're looking at Jamie there. She's a junior infrastructure engineer. She's been with the government 1.5 years. And you want to dig a little bit deeper. You want to look at what experience she has, whether it's with your organization or prior to your organization. How well is she doing through those performance evaluations and feedback? And then what are her goals? I think that's important. As you look at people, as those skills shift within your organization, as you bring on RPA and automation, and you find someone who needs a new skill or someone that needs to be reskilled, you want to find out what that individual wants to do as well. And I want to kind of touch very briefly. There was a Josh Bernson reported out on LinkedIn study, a global talent trends, and found that 70% of the organizations that are focusing on internal recruiting, that is upskilling and reskilling those individuals who are already in your organization, have about a 41% higher retention rate. And that's because you've got an employee who not only feels valued, but also extra value because you're taking the time to skill and reskill that person. So as you look at that, that's what's going to drive those hidden skills and that talent across your organization, digging a little bit deeper than just an employee and a manager discussion or what's on the particular performance report. So let's go to the next slide. I want to give you just a quick example. We did have a global healthcare and science company that did leverage this skills inference. They used it, they partnered with us to talk about those skill-based from an enterprise standpoint. They looked at 41 different skills across 11 capability areas. And you'll find a lot of people now are looking at grouping things together, grouping those skill sets together. If you haven't gone through your taxonomy, if you haven't gone through looking at your jobs in your job series, you need to be able to do that. You want to expunge multiple ways. I mean, how many ways can you have a program manager? How many ways can you have a certain lead? You want to be able to scale it down and get it to the point that you have exactly what you need in your organization and in your taxonomy. We curated data across multiple sources. I mentioned before, we had Workday, Taleo, Jira. All those can be ingested and looked at as you're driving towards what is that skill set of that individual, and then drove it forward with a feedback mechanism that went right back to the employee that said, this is what you're doing, this is where you are, what are your aspirations, do you want to move forward? If you do, we can close those gaps through learning, through training, through extra activities, if you will, within your organization. So let's just move on to the next slide. As executives, as managers, one of the real advantages is in skills inference is looking at those gaps that we mentioned. Do you have the right people who are doing the right things today? And do you have people that you have unlocked, like on this heat map? You can see those things where they have really exceeded or advanced, if you will, very dark color, then the lighter color, then the lightest color is where it's emerging. They may not be there. that allows you to be able to look at your employee, make sure that they're hitting on all cylinders for their current job, but also allows you to go ahead and look at what are those emerging skills that your organization needs for the future. And that allows that individual then to fill those gaps on that heat map and potentially take a new role. So if you have a security individual who wants to be a security manager or a cybersecurity subject matter expert, there are ways to drive that person to the skills you need for the future. So let's go to the next slide. So really sort of wrapping this up, if you will, there are, as organizations plan, as you look at what skills your organization has, what you need, you help artificial intelligence to drive those hidden skills that what the employee may not even understand about themselves. What are the skills that are required for your organization to move forward? And then using data-driven workforce planning actions to do that. And once again, using AI to support the staff. And that is, we know that a lot of our federal clients need the human to make the final decision. The artificial intelligence, the natural language processing, machine learning is there to support those decisions. And then you target, and then you help that individual grow through the concept of you've got the skills, you've got the evidence, you know the training you need to move that person forward. And then from the other side, the one thing that you want is you want that employee to be satisfied. You want that employee to stay if they're good employees and not jump from job to job. So you want to be able to retain those people with those critical skills, or who have the potential for those critical skills to reskill and upskill in your organization. And what that can do through artificial intelligence is increase accuracy. We know it's 85 to 90% accurate. It'll definitely increase the speed. I think we heard about that earlier in today's call, and also reduce bias. And that reducing bias is ensuring that your artificial intelligence is trustworthy. And we've already heard that, where people have talked about, well, I'm not so sure the AI is as trustworthy. You need to make sure those things are there, whether you're nurturing the culture, whether you've got the appropriate tools or the appropriate data and governance to make it happen. And then at the end of the day, you can reward those employees who are doing well and who are going to do well in your organization to increase the business value. So I think that's it. You want to go to the last slide? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, and to our experts for providing these opening remarks. We will now pivot to the discussion, to the Q&A, and we are grateful for all of the great questions that have already been submitted in the chat box. Mike and I will both moderate this discussion, and we will lead with your questions. And as we do so, please continue to put your questions in the chat box or raise your hand, and we will pivot to you so that you can ask the panelists your question or comment. Very grateful for your feedback. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to Mike so that we can do our first audience question.
Mike, I think you're muted.
And if Mike is having an issue on his end, I will start.
I'm back. Sorry about that. See, I messed up twice. Anyway, I want to thank the panelists for just joining us and giving us, this is incredible, just insightful. It's experience, it's doing, it's not just talking. And that's what we appreciate. Austin and I are going to do our very best to capture questions. So if you see us get a little bit behind, we'll catch up, I promise. That's where there's two of us, okay? So first off, first question came from the audience, was for Kelvin. How was your, this was from John Davis. How was your resume review software different from existing keyboard search capabilities?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. We actually did not use any keyword search in our resume review because just keyword search just hasn't really been found to be that effective. Candidates know how to game it. There's just, there's not a lot of reasons to do that aside from making it, incumbent on every candidate to include, hidden keywords in the background of their resume. And so for candidates that don't know to do that, they end up getting kicked out of the process. Our process was actually having real humans looking at everybody's resumes and then having those after you look at a resume, you say this person does or does not pass for this reason, and then having those validated by a human resource professional. And so our process was more about speeding up that interaction than actually automating that process.
Very good.
Excellent. So we had a question from Matisha to all the panelists. The question reads, introducing new technology from scratch can often require a huge human investment up front. How have you managed this lift for the workforce without overtaxing the employees to see later efficiencies and gains? And we'll open that up to the three panelists to grab as you see fit.
I'm happy to take a stab at this. For us, I would say a lot of this does tend to fall on my group, as well as some of the SMEs we deal with in the field. For this reason, it's part of the reason we are not always as fast to get things implemented as we want. We do have to be very careful scheduling things, taking things incrementally, so that we can space things out and not burden the workforce too much. Now, we do have the benefit in CBP for being a very large organization. At this point, about a little over 50,000 folks. So we could spread the pain around a bit between the different offices, especially for the larger offices. Now, on the flip side of this, though, there is the issue that when you change the technology, you do really have to spend a lot of time communicating and training the workforce on how to use these new tools. That's something we spend a lot of time on and really want to ensure they understand how to use it, because that introduces a lot of new room for error here. This is particularly true when it comes to introducing new data type tools like these dashboards. Folks are not always experts at using stats or experts at reading data. And when they're taken away from the process of creating themselves, it just makes it that much easier for them to misunderstand it and misapply it. So we do have to spend quite a bit of time with them up front on how to use it, how to interpret it, so they use it effectively and correctly.
Also, just want to tag in here as well, and just, I think you've mentioned this as well, Dr. Robbins, about doing things incrementally. And so, as much as you can push out small changes, for example, in our pilot program where we're running it with a couple agencies, with different parts of those agencies, that way so we can validate with users that this software is effective and that people do understand it. The more that you can do that before rolling out a large change, probably the easier it will be for everyone to adopt.
Yes, and one thing that we have done, or we try to accomplish when we look at implementations, is what I call the crawl, walk, run, and that is, as we just heard, is looking at a proof of concept, looking at a pilot, looking at something, picking a certain set of skills, a certain workforce segment that guarantees your organization can see that yes, it is working. Yes, it does it without affecting all of the employees. And then the other part, which I also heard and want to echo is extremely important, is we don't like to engage organizations without change management. And that is people understanding what is changing, why it's changing, and how to use what it is that we are actually implementing. So crawl, walk, run, change management, probably the best ways to go we've seen from the commercial side.
Real quick, this is Michael. A little follow-up question. Okay, just I'm an engineer by trade, so I got a lot of questions too. So, all right, so real quick. All right, so you talk about crawl, walk, run. Each one of you talked about incremental changes. Give us a little bit of idea of some of the surprises along the way. What did you discover and said, "Ooh, we can't go down this path," or "Oh, this was really good. This was a lot better than we thought." Some of your experiences in that crawl, walk. I got to my walking. How many times you skinned your knee? So, oh, you're afraid to answer.
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at this. Was that specifically for?
It's for everybody.
All right.
Okay. Sorry about that.
So yeah, I'll take a stab at this as a fellow engineer here. So in our process initially, we actually tried not to build anything. And we tried to run things on, like, anyone in government probably knows this, on Excel and email. That was our enterprise software that we attempted at first. Because we found that was too cumbersome. Then that's where we started to be like, okay, let's iterate. And then we built out this tool for subject matter experts and human resource professionals to interact. And then through that process, we were still actually sending emails, but we were resolving a lot of other issues with it. And then our next iteration was like, okay, the emails are still really painful to go through all this stuff. So now let's wrap everything into a tool. And so we basically just kept on layering on additional layers of complexity that made the process easier for everybody involved.
Very good.
Yeah, an example from us is one of our earliest uses of the bots was to really help facilitate some communication with the workforce for some of our testing programs to basically get information out there ahead of them so that they would hopefully reduce the amount of emails coming into our inbox. Because there are times we get thousands of emails, it gets overwhelming. What it ended up doing for us actually was increasing the emails. We found out that our communication may have not been as good as we thought it was. So things could happen in reverse times. But that said, it was still an important thing to find out, and it did help us improve the communications over time. So.
Yes, and same with IBM. We've had organizations, we've had professional services companies where what we decided to do was just focus on what the organization called 15 hot skills from a single business line, and then through sort of an agile process, a series of sprints that allowed us to deploy the inference and then demonstrate. And yes, there's always, if the data wasn't clean, if in fact the organization didn't have the taxonomy that we were really looking for, we're always like little skin knees, but at the end of the day, we make sure double-blind test scenarios, we want to make sure that the confidence in those results was given before anybody moved forward. So there's always little skins and knees, and that's why, through this process, what we call is fail quickly and then fix it and move on. So there's always going to be a skin knee now and then based on the various demonstrations and the sprints.
Very good. Okay. All right. So this is for Mike. This came from John Davis. How did you integrate custom tools with existing platforms, for example, USA Jobs, ERM tools, etc.?
The one thing that we rely on when we do that, whether it's Workday, and these are COTS, right? Slack, Taleo, Cornerstone, but also just through the integration process, walking the solution, and even at a small scale compared to an enterprise-wide, is looking at those integration points, confirming that we need the data out of certain things, right? So if it's out of USA Jobs, if it's out of something else, you get the source, you get the agreement, and then you integrate. And that's what we do when we try to work any one of these, because when you look at and the outputs, it's interoperable with multiple data sources and systems. So it's just doing your homework up front to integrate properly, to make sure that the data can flow properly, that it has the right schema, and then driving your solution. And then that's also potentially a knee skinner, if you will, is, do you need that data? Did that data provide you what you think you were looking for when it was looking at the skilling and the upskilling and the inference? So just what I call hardcore integration.
And Mike, we've got another one for you from Natalie. She asks, what is the current status of SME QA? Are you planning on expanding the pilot to include more agencies, etc.?
I think I'm going to steal that one from Mike, just because it's a SMEQA question here. But we will be scaling SMEQA across the government right now. We are actually doing some additional pilots. Please visit smeqa.usds.gov for more information, or I'll drop my email in the chat, and please feel free to send me an email. I can give you further information on that.
Thank you, Kelvin. Yeah, I had the incorrect note here. I appreciate that. And so, Mike, you want to take the next one?
Sure. Okay, Kelvin, you're on the block today. Okay, so here we go. This is from Vanessa. You talked about the data for AI in resume review being difficult due to the potential disparities in formats and content noise. Okay, which makes sense for private sector, but could potentially be addressed through standard format required on like USA Jobs. Do you think that this is an area where federal government could lead, or does the tolerance for risk much lower in the government, which would decrease the likelihood of adoption? That's a loaded question.
No, I love this question. I also have a lot of opinions about resumes. So in terms of the difficulties with resume, right, or with resume review specifically, if you think about it, resumes are just, they're terrible for everyone. How many people here, like probably everybody in the audience here, if you've ever applied to a job before, you've rewritten your resume specifically for that job, right? And if you haven't done that, then maybe hopefully you got another job that you did rewrite it for. And part of the reason for that is because every single job is asking you for different things, right? When one company says we are looking for an expert in, like Node.js, I'm an engineer, right? That means something very different than when another company says we're looking for an expert in Node.js. And that's at a very specific level already. When you talk about something like, people say our core qualifications are communication. Okay, well, how do I communicate to you in a resume format that I'm good at communicating, right? The only thing that I'm really communicating to you on a resume is that I'm good at writing resumes. So if we want to lead, and I think the federal government can lead here, right? In terms of the volume of applicants that we have and the amount of data that we can be getting, the federal government can become a leader in this space. The problem here is, of course, that, we have to move away from this concept of these federal resumes that are like 10, 20 pages long, and where we just hope that people know that somewhere inside that 10 or 20 pages, somewhere inside their, all of their history, that they have to include all the competencies that we've put on USA jobs, right? That doesn't make any sense. It's not user-friendly. We're creating the shell game where applicants have to hide in their competencies inside of a resume, and then subject matter experts or HR professionals have to then go find that shell somewhere within their resume, right? Instead, what we can do is we can look at a world in which we say, okay, we're going to go for these high signal, low noise things where we ask people for, okay, this is the competency we're looking for. What's your work history? What's your job title? What did you actually do at a company that qualifies you for this competency? If we build up a bank of enough data like that, right, then we can start reducing the amount of noise. Then we can start looking at employing tools like AI to evaluate that and say, okay, we have, 20, 30, 50,000 people that have all said, this is how I, have this skill set, right? And if we target it very specifically, looking at technical skills, then we can start using AI and say, okay, here's the people that very clearly have this, here's the people that very clearly don't, and then here's people that we just don't have enough data on, right? But until we start removing all that noise by first steps, I would say is, reducing the length of federal resumes, getting down to saying 2 pages, nobody's 10 years ago. I don't know what I did 10 years ago, right? So that's a first step. And then the second one would be getting even more targeted and saying, okay, here's this competency, how do you meet that competency? What's your work history? Aside from that, I don't think very many of us actually care about everybody's, 10, 20-year long CV. Hopefully that answers the question here.
Does any other panelists want to kind of jump in on this concept?
I mean, I completely agree with what Kevin's saying. We actually, for the promotions program, have a career experience inventory we use as the application process that they basically do exactly what you're saying. They basically indicate their past experience with the different things that indicate the competencies that we need. And that's one of the key ranking tools for us.
And I agree. I think the concept of skills / competencies and ensuring that you have the right person and hopefully in the future not having, as mentioned, having to dig through 15 pages to find it, and then then putting that artificial intelligence in there to say you need to look for certain things, you need to tell us certain things, and all that comes with time. So I agree.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, so our next question comes from John, and this is to all the panelists. John asks, on the topic of change management, what were some of the biggest areas of concern or resistance, and how did you overcome them?
I would say the biggest one, excuse me, is almost always buy-in. And really, it's convincing folks that it adds value, showing folks how it makes their life easier and how it does things more simply, more accurately. That's always the most challenging piece, but also the most beneficial when it's done.
Absolutely, and I would add into that, what we have noticed as we drive things is when people talk about whether it be automation, whether it be artificial intelligence, some of the resistance comes from, not my job, you're not going to take my job away from me, when in fact it's going to enhance, as we've heard on this panel already, it's going to enhance how people do their jobs. and may actually talk about reskilling and upskilling to a new and even better position. But it's that concept of, oh, if it's going to be new, it's going to take my job, and I'm not really, I don't really want that to happen. But in fact, when it's really going to help.
Very good. Okay, this next question, I think we've answered already. This is for Kelvin. Is your tool available for agencies? And you gave us a link to take a look at. Timing. What's the timing of availability? How far do you need to get the tool to say it's ready for prime time? Those types of things. So.
Yeah, so our tool, we are running active pilots, and so if you're involved in one of those pilots, you will be using the tool. We've partnered with OPM, where they will be building out a resume review tool inside of USA Staffing. So if you're a USA Staffing customer, you will have it available in the future. In terms of the exact timing, I would say expect like maybe in the next 12 months or so, possibly, hopefully sooner. But of course, building out software takes some time.
Okay, very good. All right.
I think it might be worth using a few moments here, Mike, to get into some of the, not the controversy, but some of the more compelling issues that were discussed regarding privacy and regarding the AI tools for the resume search. I'm curious, this is to the panelists, what you think about the future of these technologies that are not yet ready. Do you see a future in which they will be ready, or do you think that we have an unrealistic expectation for this technology? Let us know your thoughts.
This is Mike. I believe that especially when we look at artificial intelligence, mimicking, if you will, the cognitive capabilities and using them to our advantage, they exist. Like everything in life, it has to learn. I think the one thing that is concerning that we are driving for now is the concept of trustworthy, right? How do you wring bias out of artificial intelligence? And I mentioned it very early on about how you want to be able to take, it's more than just kind of a responsible design, development, and use of it. You really have to drive, fair and transparent AI to your organization so that there is buy-in, so there's no secret black box out there, but also ensuring that the individuals who are driving artificial intelligence, the ones who are in the organizations and making it happen, are also representative across the board. And therefore, you're beginning to wring some of that bias out because you do have that culture, if you will, that broad-based organization that's working with you, making sure you have those trustworthy tools. That, you have to have something that's going to, talk about transparency. We talked a lot about that, but also fairness and privacy. And that's something that everyone is scared when they talk artificial intelligence. They think robots. They think, a big brain, when in fact it is literally using the data. And as we heard earlier, that data is messy, right? There's growing mounds of data. It's rough. It's overwhelming. It's messy. It does lack structure at times. But in fact, that's where artificial intelligence comes in. But unless you wring out the bias, unless you determine that data is not biased. And we had an example where we had an organization in the federal government, and they were using artificial intelligence, and one of the areas that it was looking at was selective service date. And no one thought twice about it till they realized that selective service date meant male or potential. So that there's always that bias out there. So I think it's ready. I think it needs to be learned. I think we still have a long way to go in life to ensure that transparency, that trustworthiness in AI is there, and that we wring the bias out.
Yeah, and to expand on that, my group were both developers of assess selection tools as well as consumers of third-party tools as well. There are times we have contracts to buy things. And one thing that's been clear with this is there are times we definitely need to see more documentation, more transparency about how these tools are developed, how they're validated, the reliability, because without that information, it definitely makes it hard to really know this is a tool that we want. There's actually a really good paper recently by Tippins, Oswald, and McPhail. I think it's still in pre-press at the moment, but it's available online. But they really go through how we could extend some of the test development standards, like the SIA principles, standards for education, psychological testing, to some of the AI selection tools. And it's something that I think there's probably not enough of right now in the field, and there's still some work needs to be done on it as well. But by having that background, having that information available, I think it really would help feel secure in using these tools, secure in defending the tools as well if a grievance ever occurred.
I'm gonna put a counterpoint out here real quick on this and just say that I don't know if there is any removing bias from AI. We can reduce it, we can mitigate it. I don't think there's any world in which we can actually remove all the bias. Taking a very simple, unless we have every single data point in the universe, right? Then we might be able to remove some of the bias. But without that, right, taking an absurd example for a moment, just to make the point very clear, is, if we have an AI that evaluates a bunch of people for whatever thing, it classifies them. If it sees an alien, it doesn't know what to do with that. It's going to be biased against that alien, right? Whereas a human being, one of us, fortunately, our neural networks up here are whatware works a little bit better, where we can say, okay, wait, I recognize that I have this bias against this, alien being, so I'm not going to evaluate them, in exactly the same way. Whereas a machine, has no sense of, has no concept of justice, has no culture, has no background like that. It's literally whatever data that we put into it, it's going to create a lot of patterns based off of that data, right? And those patterns, there's another word for patterns like that, by the way, which is bias, right? But as human beings, we can shut down that bias. And so I think that's one thing I want to raise up is, without auditing the algorithms and the inputs and outputs of that, and looking at all the users that are actually using this and that are affected by it, and that goes for all the edge cases, we can't actually remove all that bias. We can reduce it, we can mitigate it, but I don't want anyone thinking that we can actually remove it.
Let me follow up with that because it's interesting. We just got another question, which is kind of like right in this conversation, but I want to talk about this. Okay, well, in the ethical use of AI, in a paper that ACT-IAC put out, okay, we actually talked about, one of the areas that we had to be real careful of. We talked about bias. You have to look at bias. One of them was really interesting: responsible use. Okay, so there's a responsibility when you put a tool together that it's not going to be used outside of its intended use. I said that weird, but you kind of know what I'm talking about. Okay. And this is kind of, okay, I want to hear from everybody, but Mike, this is kind of pointing to you a little bit because you talk a lot about looking at a candidate's, that's probably a bad word, digital footprint. How do you keep your technology from being used or abused? There you go. Make sense?
Yeah. Yep, it does. And that's something that we're always concerned about. And that is in ensuring that the controls are there. With that, I mean, once it gets into an organization's hands, if in fact they have sole source of it, we can only hope that we have driven and pounded home the idea that its intended use is to do X, that you have buy-in from your employees because you are looking at their digital, footprint, and that you do have their buy-in. I mean, I would imagine, and we would think sometimes that when an individual is going to have their persona, their skills looked at and potentially looking for upskilling, reskilling, maybe a better job, that would be obvious, but it isn't. So the concept is, how do you put the security around the various AI, whether it's, natural language, whether it's machine learning? How do you do that to ensure that no one gets it? We know that we secure it so that it doesn't end up in the hands of someone else. We're very clear in the federal government. Everything.
Hey, Mike, I think we lost you there for a moment.
Can you hear me back? Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're good now.
And so I'll just really very briefly is one, we try to maintain the security to ensure that it doesn't reach other hands. And then we can describe and monitor if in fact we are doing that to ensure it's not used for its purpose that it was not intended for. And so it's monitoring, it's being secure, it's putting in a secure environment. But at the end of the day, it's got to be that person at the other end in that organization also understands that you don't use it for its unintended use.
Dr. Robbins?
I would say one of my concerns with digital footprint would be, first of all, did the employees consent for you using it? It's a concern for me from an ethical standpoint. Another concern is really how that relates back to the job requirements, because especially from the selection side of things, if we can't relate it back to a job requirement, it may not be something that we'd be comfortable using. And I guess the third point with it is when it comes to digital footprint, that's such a broad, wide thing. Is it something that they themselves have out there digitally? Is it something from acquaintances, friends that they may have no control over and may not even be representing them accurately? So I guess how to deal with that noise and some of that bias is a concern to us from using it for our sort of work.
Very good.
Some other considerations I'd also throw out there for things like digital footprints are, of course, making sure that there's consent. That's already been discussed, I think, at length, and also making sure that's on a very granular level. But I think something that we don't talk a lot about is making sure that people have access to the data that is about them, right? So if you're having your digital footprint collected as an employee of an organization, I'd hope that you would have a way to actually see what digital footprint they are collecting about you. That way, so you can correct things that are incorrect. If you have consented to this, that you can correct things that are incorrect, and that you are able to keep an eye on what it is that people are evaluating your skill set for.
Oh, very good. All right, one more follow-up question, and then we're going to try to wind this down. All right, so Kelvin, we're engineers, okay? A lot of times, our problem is not a technology problem. It's not a technical problem. We can usually do what we need to do. I remember years ago trying to introduce some technology, and we were working in federal government, and the problem wasn't technology, the problem was labor unions, okay? So how much do you guys work with the labor unions, and how much purview, or what's the right word, how much leverage do they have in what you're doing with your technologies?
So I'll kick off here since you mentioned we're engineers here. I'll say that SMEQA actually hasn't worked a lot with labor unions, mostly because all of our processes are within the competitive service, and we're following those things very specifically. And so we haven't, and again, part of the, our process is not using AI because it's just, we didn't feel that it was there yet. And so I'm sure that we would love to work with labor unions though.
Yeah, same here. Most of our work doesn't really involve labor unions. Most of what we do is supervisory and managerial promotion testing. So that's out of their purview, as well as entry-level pre-employment testing. So for the most part, we don't have to get involved with that.
Anything, Mike?
Yeah, well, in our case, we are contracted with a particular federal government organization, and under normal circumstances, that is handled from the government side. So we just, if there's anything we need to address, we'll address it. But for the most part, it's left up to the government client.
Okay, thank you. Austin, I think we're done, sir.
I think we have a sincere thank you to our panelists for contributing their time and knowledge, and a sincere thank you to our audience for raising the fantastic questions that led this discussion. It's what we had hoped for, and we're grateful that you provided your questions. It was an enjoyable discussion, and just an enormous thank you again to our speakers and to the Emerging Technology COI for partnering with the EWF COI to make this possible. This was a lot of fun, and we hope that we see you guys again for our next meeting, and just a sincere thank you to everyone for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to turn this back over to Nancy for final. Or Nancy, still there?
Yep, I'm still here. Thanks everyone for joining us again. The Emerging Technology COI has a meeting next month featuring accessibility. So stay tuned for that. The calendar item for that meeting is on the website, so please check it out, and we hope to see you then. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.